You should just rent a cheap apartment and live there. After all, someone who just plays around at home doesn't deserve to live in this house," said Susan, who had returned from the city. She was now attempting to drive me out of the house where I was living with my in-laws, planning to take my place. My in-laws, who don't understand working from home, and my husband who wants to take the house from me, are all siding with my sister-in-law Susan. Together with Susan, my husband Mark and in-laws keep blaming me. Do they even realize who is paying for this house's mortgage? That's when it struck me, if I left, who would pay the monthly mortgage of $4,600? There's no reason for me to continue living with these people who make me feel so terrible. If they want me to leave, then I'll leave. I've endured enough, and finally, my anger has reached its peak. I'll change the ownership and mortgage to your name, I told my husband. With that, I divorced my overjoyed husband Mark and left the house. Little did they know, they would soon face an unexpected situation. My name is Emily. I used to live with my husband Mark, who is 2 years older than me. I met Mark while working at a company. However, it wasn't the typical office romance, as Mark was working for the cleaning company that serviced my office. When I met my husband, I had just lost both of my parents in quick succession. First, my father was diagnosed with an illness, and the doctors gave him only 3 months to live. While caring for him, my mother fell ill too, and despite her fight, they both passed away, leaving me alone. Having no siblings, I suddenly found myself all by myself, struggling to accept the reality that my parents were gone. After their passing, I would often find myself thinking of them at random moments and tearing up. However, I tried to hide my feelings from those around me who were being considerate. I think I forced myself to smile all the time while at work. The first time my husband Mark spoke to me, I was trying not to let anyone notice as I stood in the hallway during a break, staring blankly outside the window, lost in thoughts of my parents. I had seen Mark at work before and we had exchanged nods, but we had never spoken, and I didn't even know his name. Yet, Mark approached me as I looked out the window and asked, "Are you okay? You seem a bit down." In response to my husband Mark's gentle inquiry, I found myself talking about my parents. Maybe it was easier because he was a stranger whose name I didn't even know. When Mark heard about my parents passing, he sympathized, saying he was close to his own parents and could understand the loneliness. I was glad that Mark listened to my story. After that, we started having brief conversations whenever we saw each other. We saw each other at work, and it didn't take long before we started meeting outside of work. Soon after we started dating, Mark introduced me to his parents. As Mark had mentioned, he seemed to have a good relationship with them. His parents, aware of my loss, were considerate and invited me to visit them anytime. I quickly grew close to my in-laws, and without a formal proposal, it naturally led to me marrying Mark. After the wedding, we rented an apartment near my in-laws and started our life together. After getting married, I quit my job and switched to a company that allowed me to work fully remotely from home. I did this considering the possibility of having children with Mark in the future. I told Mark about my career change, but it seems he didn't quite understand it. For now, he just knows that I work from home using my computer. Since my salary didn't change after switching jobs, I decided to take care of the living expenses. Mark earned less than I did, so we agreed that I would pay for our expenses, while Mark would save his salary, except for what he spent on social activities. Mark didn't have any expensive hobbies, and before we married, his social expenses were mostly just dates with me or going out with friends. Mark himself said he was okay with me managing our savings, so this is how we handled our finances. Working from home was all positives for me. Above all, I was happy that I could enjoy leisurely meals with Mark when he came home. This wouldn't have been possible if I were still working at my previous company. Before marriage, I often made simple meals just for myself, but now, wanting to please Mark, I find myself wanting to cook more elaborate dishes. Our life together was passing by peacefully. Then, a few years into our marriage, something shocking happened. My in-laws' house was completely destroyed in a fire. Fortunately, my in-laws were unharmed, but they lost not only all their possessions but also irreplaceable memories like photo albums. For a while, my in-laws stayed in our apartment, and they were deeply upset. I wanted to cheer up the two people who would help me heal from the loss of my own parents. So I did everything I could to care for them. I cooked, of course, and also took care of the household chores during breaks from work, making sure they felt comfortable. On weekends, Mark and I would go out with them. However, my in-laws were conscious of being a burden and struggled to regain their usual cheerfulness. They often mentioned that they couldn't stay with us forever and were concerned about imposing on us. So my husband Mark and I decided to build a house to live with my in-laws. Until now, my in-laws had never brought up the idea of living together, but in one way or another, Mark and I had been considering it. In preparation, I had been saving from my salary separate from the savings my husband was making. My husband was making plans to get a mortgage sooner rather than later. I suggested that we take this opportunity to build a house. My in-laws were thrilled, and we quickly came to an agreement. The house they had been living in was a charming wooden structure built by my great-grandfather. It had served them well when they were younger, but as they aged, they started experiencing various health issues. As a result, they had many requests for the new house. Mark also had his own ideas for the house, believing that if we were going to build it, we should do it right. However, the final cost ended up being much higher than we had anticipated. Despite this, I convinced myself that we would be living in this house for a long time, so I agreed to build a house that met all three of their requests. However, I began to sense that something was off. Mark was taking excessive credit for building the house to his parents, Karen and John, and they were constantly thanking only him. This was despite the fact that the house and mortgage were in my name, and the down payment came from my savings. It seemed like Mark had not mentioned this to Karen and John at all. Perhaps because of his insistence that it was his house, Karen and John started pressuring me to thank Mark as well. While I do appreciate Mark not just for the financial aspect, I paid more because I was able to, not because I wanted gratitude from him or Karen and John. However, even when Karen and John said such things to me, Mark did not stand up for me. Instead, he jokingly said, "That's right, you should be grateful to me for letting you live in a new house." I was upset after being repeatedly told falsehoods. I understand that Mark has his pride, so I did not ask him to tell his parents the whole truth, but I did ask him to stop making it seem like I had done nothing. However, Mark, perhaps feeling more confident because of our new house construction, just would not listen. And then I found out that Mark told a terrible lie to his parents. He had claimed that he worked at the same company where I used to work. The company I worked for is a well-known major corporation. While it is true that Mark still has dealings with that company, I began to notice his lies and his inflated pride, which made me increasingly distrustful of him. I also felt uncomfortable because his parents always seemed to favor him. Despite this, I thought that once we moved into our new home, the issue of who built the house would no longer be a problem, so I patiently endured. However, once our new home was completed and we started living there, their attitude towards me clearly changed. It seemed like my in-laws, just like Mark, did not understand the concept of working from home. They thought I was just playing around because I did not go out during the day and was always at my computer. Mark had been complaining to them that I was not doing anything. Complaining to them that Emily is just playing around all day, and they seemed to have completely believed it. Before we moved, they never said anything, maybe because they felt I was taking care of them, but the sarcasm increased as soon as we moved. They say, "Mark built such a fine house and you just stay in and play around. Must be nice. Why don't you work a little and help Mark out?" Even when I was working on my computer, they would come to my room just to make these snide remarks. The discomfort made me leave the house more and more, working from a cafe instead. I repeatedly appealed to Mark to clear up his parents' misunderstanding. While Mark might not understand the work I do, it's my salary that's supporting his and his parents' lifestyle. All I needed was for him to tell his parents that. But Mark just said, "Just let them say whatever they want," still not listening. Since I was supposedly not working, I got saddled with all the housework, and his parents started bossing me around. I couldn't take it anymore and finally stood up to his parents. Mark was there too, and I thought he would finally take my side, seeing how upset I was. But instead, he yelled at me, "Don't talk back." Then he thrust a completed divorce paper at me, threatening divorce if I didn't comply. I had never seen Mark so angry before, and his behavior completely intimidated me, making me succumb to him and his parents' demands. From that day on, both his parents and Mark's attitudes towards me turned utterly cold. The only time I felt seen and could find some solace was when I was working at my computer. I immersed myself in work to forget the treatment I received from my in-laws and husband. One day, my sister-in-law Susan, who had been living in the city, came back to visit. She was coming to see the new house and planned to stay for a while. My in-laws immediately started complaining about me to her. They said, "Emily is always cooped up in her room playing on her computer. Does she even realize whose generosity allows her to live in such a nice house? What on earth is she doing on that computer all day? Playing games? Is she some kind of nerd? That's just weird. We don't really understand all this, but maybe she's one of those nerds, you think? If she's always on her computer, she must be one, right? Isn't she ashamed of not working?" Trying to escape their loud conversation meant for me to hear. I went to my room. Then I heard something even more shocking. They said, "Wasn't Emily just a cleaner at Mark's company? It's amazing how she lies about working from home. She couldn't possibly have the skills for that." Susan was talking as if my and Mark's roles were completely reversed. Since Mark had told his parents he worked at a major corporation, maybe he was the one who should be ashamed of not working. Maybe he had also lied that I was a cleaner. The real liar here was Mark. I wanted to tell this to Karen and Susan, but given everything that had happened, I doubted they would believe me. So I just gave up. Ever since Susan came to visit, my place at the dining table was taken over by her, and I couldn't even eat at the same time as everyone else. While they ate the meals I prepared during my work breaks, I would be secluded in my room, continuing my work. This went on for a week, and the day for Susan to return to the city came. But suddenly, Susan declared, "I'm gonna live in this house too." After staying here, I found it quite comfortable. "I just quit my job, so I've decided to move back here," she said. Susan had been working in the apparel industry, but she got tired of the interpersonal dynamics and decided to take a break. Susan's family home was being rebuilt, so when she returned and saw our new house, she found it more luxurious than she had expected. Leaving the city to start a business here could be good. "At my level, I can work from anywhere," she said. My in-laws, Karen and John, were thrilled with Susan's words. Mark seemed quite pleased with the compliments about the house too. However, there was no designated room for Susan in this house. Until now, she had been staying in the guest room, but if she were to live here, another room for Susan would be needed, and the house had no spare rooms. Susan had realized this after living with us for a week. She told me, "I'll live here, so you should leave," Susan said with a smug, malicious grin. "People who just play around at home don't deserve to live in a house like this. You should find some cheap apartment somewhere and live there." "No, this house is mine because That's a good idea. You do nothing but stay at home all day every day." Karen sided with Susan, leaving me no room to argue. I tried desperately to explain my job, but Susan, who had just said that work could be done from anywhere, wouldn't understand about working from home. Just because I'm not going out, they say I'm not working. They're trying to corner me with such an absurd argument. After everything that's happened, I'm really starting to get angry. Mark doesn't try to speak the truth, just stands there laughing and watching the situation. Until now, I kept quiet, considering Mark's position. But I finally told Karen, John, and Susan that this house was built in my name. I'm paying for all the mortgage and all the living expenses. The down payment came from my savings, and Mark hasn't paid a single penny. Seeing me speak up to this extent, Mark was clearly panicked. However, the only things that came out of his mouth were words to berate me and self-serving statements to hide the truth. Truth. He shouted at me, calling me noisy, telling me to shut up, calling me a liar. Mark was obviously flustered, and it was clear he was hiding something. Yet Karen, John, and Susan still defended him, calling me a liar. No matter how many times I said it wasn't a lie, they would not believe me. That's when it struck me, if I left, who would pay the monthly mortgage of $4,600? There was no reason for me to continue living with these people, enduring such unpleasantness. If this house was supposedly built by Mark, who works at a major corporation, maybe it should truly be his. With that thought, I decided to sign the divorce papers that Mark had pushed on me again, intending to threaten me. When I offered to change the house's title to Mark's name, he was so delighted he almost danced. He must have thought the house would now fully become his own, in name and reality. He's not wrong, but Mark is misunderstanding one thing. Initially, to change the mortgage to his name, we tried to go through the process together, but Mark disliked the complex procedures and told me to handle it alone, reluctant to go. Just go and listen to all that complicated stuff, he said. It's just a name change, right? Get it ready for my signature only. Since that wasn't possible, I took the reluctant Mark to the bank and a legal professional for consultation. Throughout, Mark didn't listen to the explanations and just played with his smartphone. When it came to signing the documents, he finally became eager. If I sign this, the house will be in my name, right? After I confirmed, he happily signed the documents. Once all the procedures were completed, both the house and the mortgage would finally be Mark's. I've explained it several times, but I wonder if Mark has truly realized it. He was ecstatically reporting to Karen, Susan, and John. Even after hearing this, how could they still believe that Mark works at a major corporation and I'm unemployed? I watched this scene with a feeling of astonishment. After changing the house and mortgage to his name, I filed for divorce. We're going on a trip to commemorate this, so you better move out while we're gone, Mark said. While waiting for the procedures to finalize, Mark took Karen, Susan, and John on a ridiculous divorce celebration trip. They were apparently going abroad and wouldn't be back for about 10 days. During that time, I sold all the furniture and appliances I had brought into the house and packed my belongings into the car, ready to leave. While handling various procedures in parallel, I was also looking for a new house and moved immediately after packing my belongings. The place we chose for our fresh start was the top floor of a high-rise condo. It was a stroke of luck that this mansion worth about $5 million was available. However, I thought it must have become available just for me, given the timing, and I decided to boldly purchase it. For the past few years, living with Karen, John, and Mark had been restless, so I was thrilled about my new life ahead. In fact, I had an inheritance left by my deceased parents. I had been investing using that inheritance even before marrying Mark. Initially intended as just a way to earn some pocket money, these investments turned out to be a huge success, and now my assets amount to several $1 million. I had planned to use that money for a relaxed, early retirement with Mark in the future. I had kept this asset a secret, intending to surprise Mark, but now I'm truly glad I never mentioned it. If I had told them, Karen, John, and Susan might have joined forces to take my assets. Living with that family, I painfully learned just how careless they are with money. The house I lived in with Mark and his parents was decorated mainly based on their preferences, so it wasn't to my taste. With the move to the condo, I took the opportunity to create a space I love, carefully crafting the interior to my liking. Now it has become the perfect space, surrounded only by things I adore. Above all, there's no one around to make snide remarks, so I can happily work from home. Once things settle down, I'm planning to join a cooking class or yoga studio. Finally, in this enjoyable and free time, I have regained a peaceful mind for the first time in years. The call from Mark came they returned from their trip abroad. He must have realized that the furniture and appliances were gone upon returning home. He demanded them back, but I paid no attention. Everything was bought with my money, so it's my prerogative to do what I want with it. I didn't want to leave anything of mine in the house of those who had caused me so much suffering, not even the furniture and appliances. Of course, they were unnecessary for my new home. When I told Mark that I had already sold them, he still demanded to buy them back immediately. It's impossible. You, working at a major corporation, should just buy new ones. I retorted and then hung up the phone. That day, Mark called several times, but I ignored all of his calls. Months had passed since Mark and his family returned from their overseas trip. I had completely forgotten about my previous life and was having a great time, getting along well with my neighbors. That day I was returning from a cooking class I attended, invited by a friend who lived on the floor below. Suddenly I received a call from Mark, and although I was suspicious, I answered, thinking there might be an issue with the paperwork that needed attention. I answered the phone, and immediately Mark shouted in a loud voice, "What is this all about?" It was just like the day they returned from their overseas trip. Wondering if there was anything else besides the furniture and appliances that could have angered my husband, I decided to listen closely. It turns out he had finally noticed the amount of the loan repayments. When he opened the letter that had arrived at the house, he saw that the loan repayment amount was listed as $4,600 per month, which is why he called in a panic. Wasn't the loan already paid off? He exclaimed. Of course not. The bank explained everything clearly, didn't they? That's impossible. I never heard about it. And with the fire insurance and your savings, why didn't you pay off the mortgage? No way, that's impossible. Do you even realize how much that house was worth? Shockingly, it seems Mark believed the mortgage was already paid off. Despite the bank's detailed explanation, which Mark had nodded to, he was apparently under a different impression. I was sitting right next to him, watching and listening, so I remember it well. Even if Mark wasn't paying attention, he had already signed the mortgage transfer, so it's too late now. Mark kept trying to find a way out of the mortgage payments, but there was nothing I could do about it. Eventually, he seemed to realize that he had no choice but to repay the loan and fell silent, seemingly frustrated. "I thought you'd be struggling to find a place to live," Mark said, clearly under the impression that I was in a dire situation. The reason Mark could freely spend his salary until now was because I was the one covering our living expenses. Even after our divorce, I have no trouble living on my own. It's too late for him to realize that he was relying on me for everything. I wonder what kind of life my pretentious ex-husband Mark has been leading these past few months with his parents, Karen and John. Most likely they were living luxuriously, doing whatever Susan suggested, and then he realized there was a mortgage to be paid. I wonder what Mark is going to do now, I thought, as if it were someone else's problem. Since we're practically strangers now, I couldn't care less about how much trouble my ex-husband and his parents, Karen and John, are in. Seeing my husband so frustrated, I decided to tell him the truth. Too bad. I moved into a luxury condo with the money I made from a successful investment. Then while he was speechless, I hung up the phone. There were no calls from him after that, so I thought he had managed somehow, but then out of the blue, he called again. When I answered, wondering what it was about this time, it turns out their house had been seized, and he was in a panic. In the background, I could hear the voices of his parents, Karen and John, and his sister Susan, all sounding pretty desperate. What should I do? Help me, Emily. My husband, whom I had kicked out, desperately pleaded. A person claiming to be an enforcement officer was visiting the house, and I could hear the voices of his parents, Karen and John, and his sister Susan in the background, also addressing the officer. According to this officer, the house was about to be put up for auction, with details like the auction date and bidding period to be decided. Once the auctioneer was determined and ownership transferred, my husband and his family would be evicted from the house. I thought they must have received warning letters leading up to this, but when I asked my husband, he sounded confused and said they hadn't arrived. However, that couldn't be right, and after persistent questioning, he finally admitted in a small voice, maybe they did arrive. It turned out he had intentionally ignored the letters, realizing they were about loan repayments. The envelopes were already open before I saw them. I thought someone was taking care of the payments. Probably Karen, John, and Susan thought the same as my husband. Eventually, a demand for the lump sum repayment of the loan arrived, and it seems my husband and his family were aware of the loan, but continued to ignore it, thinking someone else would pay it. And so the house was finally seized. Can't you do something now, like pay it off? You could pull everyone's savings. There's gotta be a way. I said, unable to hide my frustration at my husband's helpless tone. But all he could say in response to my suggestion was, "It's impossible." Apparently, Karen and John had squandered their savings on an extravagant overseas trip and were planning to rely on their son, who works in a big company, for their future. It was all just their assumption, and Susan, his sister, who claimed she had quit her job to come back home, was actually fired for embezzling company funds. She talks as if she's been hugely successful in the city, but in reality she was just a modestly paid accountant in a small to mid-sized company. Yet she got hooked on visiting nightclubs, gradually embezzling money from her company to splurge on them. Even though she actually returned home relying on her parents, Karen and John, she had the nerve to make such grand claims. As for my ex-husband, after our divorce, he pretended to be working at a large corporation and started dipping into his savings to cover living expenses. Both Karen, John, and Susan lived lavishly, and the money he had saved while we were married was completely gone. Then came the demand for the lump sum repayment of the loan. As our previously hidden financial situations came to light, it seemed like the focus was shifting from the court case to each other. In the midst of this, my ex-husband started clinging to me. "Please, Emily, you're living in that high-rise luxury condo now, right? Let's all live together there again." I refuse. We're divorced now, and as far as I'm concerned, we're strangers. Although I felt a bit sorry for him earlier, I definitely don't want to live with those people ever again. Hearing the voices of my ex-in-laws, Karen, John, and Susan in the background, I felt more resolved, and so I firmly declined my ex-husband's offer. Upon hearing my refusal, Karen, John, and Susan immediately started hurling insults at me. I heard various derogatory terms like heartless, scammer, and thief. Perhaps out of spite for being rejected, my ex-husband joined Karen, John, and Susan in berating me. The noise over the phone was unbearable. Despite everything being the result of their own actions, there was no sign of remorse from them. Eventually, all four of them started a blame game, leaving me out of it and beginning to argue among themselves. I decided then and there to never involve myself with these people again, quietly hung up the phone, and blocked my ex-husband's number. A few days later, I came across a concerning headline in a corner of the newspaper. The article was about a father and son getting into a fist fight and the police being called out, which made me suspect it was about my ex-husband and his father. I decided to contact a mutual acquaintance of ours who lives near my ex-in-law's home. Sure enough, the incident reported in the newspaper was about them, and it happened after I'd hung up the phone on my ex-husband. The article mentioned that a neighbor noticed the fight and called the police, leading to their arrest. My ex-husband, his father, along with Karen and Susan, who tried to intervene, all sustained injuries that would take about 2 weeks to heal completely. After receiving a stern warning from the police, they were released. But the incident making the newspapers meant my ex-husband, although not fired, faced severe reprimands at his workplace. The cause of the parent-child fight was embellished and quickly spread throughout the company. My ex-husband feels uncomfortable at work, but can't afford to quit due to financial necessities. Eventually, a buyer was found for the house, and they were forced to move out. Somehow they managed to find a new place, but it's an old, cramped, bug-infested apartment, a far cry from their previous home where the family of 4 began their new life. Bugs appearing daily in the room are causing Susan and Karen to make such a fuss that they have already received complaints from the neighbors. They tried to work and rent a new house quickly, but both in-laws and Susan seem to get into trouble at work and end up being fired. Especially Susan, with her past of embezzling company funds becoming widely known, is finding it difficult to get rehired. It looks like they will have to continue living on my ex-husband's income alone. My ex-husband seems to be trying to find out where I live, asking our mutual acquaintances persistently. Finds my condo, he will just be turned away by the full-time concierge. I gratefully accepted the advice from my acquaintance and made sure to ask the concierge to be on the lookout. With this, the turmoil with my ex-husband and his family finally comes to an end. It has not even been a year since I left that house, but it already feels like a distant past event. I have completely adapted to life in my luxury condo, enjoying my days filled with hobbies and work. I plan to enjoy my carefree single life for a while without thinking about marriage.